Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Vissa with Adam Schrader. Shout out to all our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. Today we have Geoff Manaugh on the show. He's a renowned futurist and publisher of the architecture blog, BLDGBLOG, like building blog. He's a former editor at Dwell magazine, former editor-in-chief at Gizmodo, and a contributing editor at Wired. He's a New York Times bestselling author of A Burglar's Guide to the City and the new book, Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine. His short story titled Ernest was published by Vice in October 2017. It's currently being adapted for film by Netflix, with Christopher Landon attached to direct. His October 2018 horror story Summerland was also published by Vice, and it was optioned for film as well, with news forthcoming. Maybe he can share that news with us. In 2016, Manaugh's feature for the Daily Beast about an LA bank robber allegedly sent overseas to plot heists against Qaeda was optioned for development as a feature film for Sony Pictures Studio 8. His 2017 profile of an experimental intelligence gathering unit at the LA airport was published by The Atlantic, and that was also optioned for development by Lionsgate Television. So without further ado, Geoff Manaugh, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home Show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
I thought it was important to read that entire bio because you're not like a one and done author. You write fiction, you write nonfiction. You've had some very successful books. You've written short stories. You've done a lot of stuff. And not only have you done that, but you've, like I mentioned in the intro, optioned these pieces out. You've signed big book deals, Hollywood movie deals, Netflix deals. Let's start with your background. Who is Geoff Manaugh? How did you get into just writing so much, so many different genres? And how did you get to where you are today?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, but I'd say, I think the relatively short answer, I think, is just, ever since I discovered writing. So when I was a little kid, like 5 years old, I just really liked doing it. And the idea of telling stories and writing things down. And, I'd be given assignments at school to produce, some tiny little narrative about something. And I would turn it into, a 5-page short story or like a 25-page novella, which when you're 8, 9, 10 years old is a relatively long thing to be writing. But I just always loved it. I love telling stories. I love getting lost in these kind of worlds. I like that eventually turned into really liking meeting people and reporting stories, learning about other people's lives. And that really kind of informed my journalism. And so I guess I'd say that just as an adult, I've had the really sort of, fortuitous opportunity to write for a living. And so, I've got the architecture blog to cover a lot of interests that come up in the architecture, urbanism, technology kind of space, and then writing fiction is just like a really exciting way to invent worlds and characters and storylines and see where those go. And then I still, of course, do journalism. So, going out into the field, flying around to places all around the world and meeting people and interviewing them for different stories. And so, I guess I'd say as a writer, I think it's really important, to have those different kinds of outlets, because I definitely know that you can get burnt, or speaking for myself, I can get really burnt out only doing reporting. I can also get burnt out just being stuck in the world of fiction. And I can also get burnt out, only covering architecture and design. So I think it's really nice to be able to switch back and forth between them. And that's something I'd recommend other writers also work on, having a pretty diverse approach to writing.
So which one would you say is like your passion? Like if you had to kind of pick one of the styles of writing, what would you say is kind of your favorite to write?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, I would probably say fiction. It's just a really, really exciting way to be able to create things. And, I used to joke that all you need is, just a spiral bound notebook and a ballpoint pen, and you can pretty much like create worlds anywhere you go, whether it's a coffee shop or a hotel room or your bedroom, whatever it might be, the back of a car. there's so many different things that you can do with writing, and it doesn't require, as we just saw with the COVID-19 lockdown, going out into the field and interviewing people and hopping on planes, and that's a very exciting thing to do, and I definitely love that aspect of journalism. But I think as the lockdown showed, when you can't do that and everything is just a phone interview, or people won't even talk to you because they're sick or in the hospital because of this pandemic, to have something to rely back, to fall back on, writing fiction, I think was really important and good for me. So I'd say that is maybe the outlet I love the most, which I think is a little ironic because it's definitely the one that I've published the least in. But hopefully that will change.
Well, that ties into your latest book, Until Proven Safe: The History and Future of Quarantine. So number one question is, did you write this book in quarantine from home? And well, let's just start with that question. The writing process of that book, was it done in quarantine at home?
Well, so the book was finished in quarantine, and but we had actually started it. This is my co-author, who's also my wife, Nicola Twilley. We actually started reporting the book back in 2016. So, we set off on a big trip through Europe and met quarantine experts and historians and architects and talked to them about quarantine. And that went on for several years until COVID hit. And then when COVID hit, that was when obviously the writing was on the wall. Our editor, was knocking on our door, wanting to know where the book was and thinking, this is the perfect time. You guys should get this thing out. And so we did finish writing it during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was funny actually, because the book that we originally pitched our editor and that we were contracted to write was actually called The Coming Quarantine, because our theory was that we're all going to be quarantining more in the future, not less, as more and more strange diseases are emerging from different parts of the world. And then people hop on planes and they bring those diseases to major cities like New York or London. And, we don't have vaccines for many of them. We may not even necessarily know what those diseases are. And so quarantine, which seems really outdated and kind of like a last ditch thing, is actually going to become more important. That was our thesis. And so we had to change the title. When COVID-19 hit, all of a sudden at one point there was more than half of humanity, within either quarantine or some sort of stay-at-home order. And so, the idea of The Coming Quarantine, was kind of absurd. But obviously the quarantine had arrived. And so, so we finished it up and it just came out last month.
I don't know how did you get this idea in 2016? Because when this happened in March 2020, the lockdowns, initially I thought this was just a bunch of lies and fear mongering and that we'd be out of this in like a week. How did you foresee this in 2016? How did you think this was such a good topic for a book? I would have thought that was random and fear mongering.
Yeah. I mean, you would not have been the first. There were other people who just thought, even good friends of ours who thought, okay, this is a really obscure, niche topic. And, they didn't entirely understand why we wanted to write an entire book on it. But I'd say a couple things there. I mentioned that I have a background at writing about architecture. And I think that one of the things that really kind of got me into this at first was just noticing all these old quarantine stations in cities like Sydney, Australia, all around Europe, even in parts of the United States, Ellis Island, for example, in the New York Harbor. There were sites of quarantine. There were buildings meant to help contain a disease. And so as an architecture writer, it just seemed really interesting to me to maybe look at the history of that kind of building. What were quarantine stations? Who built them? Were they actually medically sound designs, or were they just like warehouses for humans? What was a quarantine facility? But the obvious thing that happens as soon as you start looking into that is that, it's not what was quarantine. Quarantine still happens. It's just that people tend not to know about it. So, there still is quarantine for diseases like Ebola. We use quarantine in the food supply because we have to protect crops and fruits and even animals from diseases. And we use quarantine to help, prevent an entire harvest being wiped out. We even use quarantine in space exploration. So, NASA has an entire thing called planetary protection, where they use quarantine for astronauts going to and from the International Space Station, but also for rovers and whatnot that get sent to other planets, like the Mars rover, which we actually saw and document in the book. And so, in other words, as we started pulling on the string of quarantine, it just led so many places. It took us back to medical history, but it also looked into the future of smart homes. It took us to NASA, but it also took us to the World Health Organization. It just went to so many different places that I think that's when we realized, this would make a really, really interesting book. And on top of that, we just thought that quarantine, and again, this is before COVID, it just seemed like it wasn't outdated. It felt like one of those things that people have kind of forgotten about, but it's going to rear its head again. And sure enough, it did. And so, COVID was kind of ironically, I guess it kind of proved our thesis, that quarantine is much more important than people think it is. And then thus, when the book came out, it seems like, I guess it was just a well-timed investigation for Nikki and I to be engaged on for the book to come out now.
So what are some ways, you chronicle, obviously based on the title, the history, what are some of the ways people have done quarantining effectively and ineffectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that I think is important to point out, especially because of the idea of like fear mongering and the way that stuff is presented, quarantine is always leaky. Like it's never total. And quarantine, somebody gets out of it when they shouldn't have, or someone's put into it when they didn't need to be. There's always mistakes happen. But the important thing with quarantine is not that it is a total absolute solution. It's simply that it's a way of buying time until we get to the real solution. And that real solution is a cure. It's a medical treatment. It's a vaccine. It's maybe just the disease itself, is extinguished because people are no longer transmitting it to one another. But so quarantine is simply trying to buy the time and the space we need to get to that. And so if you look at it that way, quarantine can fail or be kind of leaky or be ineffective, and yet at the same time actually have a beneficial, overall effect. But anyway, having said that, throughout history, it's really quite interesting. Like the origins of quarantine were about 600 years ago in the Adriatic Sea in Europe. And the cities there, like Dubrovnik, or what is now called Dubrovnik, and Venice, used quarantine as a way to prevent diseases from the Near East spreading to the city. And so they noticed that when ships were coming in from particular ports in, what is now kind of the Near East, they noticed that this disease, the Black Death, would come with those ships. And so their idea was, okay, let's just delay the arrival of these ships for long enough to see if something changes. Because, they didn't have modern germ theory, and they didn't have like a medical reason to do this. It was more just an experiment. Let's just wait until this thing is proven safe, and then we'll bring the cargo in and see if we still get the Black Death. But so, they used to actually do quarantine, it was a group experience. So they built these things, quarantine hospitals, or lazarettos, as they were known. Where entire neighborhoods, whole ships full of people, whole towns, would go into these lazarettos, and they'd go through quarantine together, and they'd experience it as a kind of group or community process of cleansing or, achieving safety. Which is pretty interesting because if you look at quarantine now, it's almost exactly the opposite, especially in a place like the United States, where quarantine kind of just meant don't leave your apartment for 7 days, or don't leave your apartment for 2 weeks. It's very atomized. It's very individualized. It can be lonely. It can be frustrating. It can feel pointless. And I think that that's an interesting contrast to the way this public health tool of quarantine was actually invented, which was that it was meant for us all to go through it together. But, you see lots of interesting failures of quarantine. An example I'll just give, just so I don't go on too long, that I love is that you see these kinds of moments throughout the history of quarantine, but so many of them feel like the opening scene of a horror movie. Like my favorite is that at one point, I believe it was yellow fever, but there was a ship that was quarantined off the coast of Boston, and it was in the approaching kind of the end of fall, and the port froze over. And so the pilot of the ship on this quarantined vessel just jumped down onto the ice and just walked into the town. And luckily he didn't have the infection, and so he didn't start a pandemic in the city of Boston. But it's just little moments like that show that how easy it is for the best laid plans to be under to be thwarted. For somebody just to decide they're going to walk into town instead of stay on their ship, and just a catastrophe can come out of that. So anyway, there's a bunch of really interesting things like that show how quarantine can fail.
Yeah, you talk about how after the Apollo landing, astronauts were put in the Lunar Receiving Lab in Harris County, which I didn't know. Naresh and I met in Harris County. And you said, you talk about how one of the plans was if things went wrong and there was, a contagion, they would just bring the lab down, like bring the mountain down on them basically, and bury them underground. Is that still something that they even consider, with the Mars rover or something? Are they still doing stuff that drastic?
There's no evidence that they still have those plans in place, at least from the people we spoke to, who have, many other more subtle and less aggressive responses to the detection of an off-world organism. So thankfully that kind of brute force response. But yeah, the plan at that time though was that they would bury the entire facility alive, or bury the entire facility, including the people inside. And that the workers who were there actually signed a release saying that their families would not come and request their bodies, and they would just be, entombed basically forever beneath rubble, so that this off-world contagion wouldn't spread out from Harris County and take over the world. Obviously that didn't happen. They did not detect any kind of malevolent organism or even an organism on the moon rocks from Apollo. And so, they were able to do the scientific, study in safety. But another anecdote that came out of those interviews, actually, which was just kind of incredible to just have someone say on the record, was the then current planetary protection officer for NASA pointed out, because we asked her, what would happen if in the future, there's a spacecraft, a human spacecraft is coming back from Mars. It's got astronauts on it. But someone is on the spaceship and they are developing symptoms of some kind of very strange and very frightening disease that is clearly not terrestrial. What would happen? Would we let them land? What would be the current plan? But it was very interesting, just sort of, I guess, in a moment of candor. She actually said that, there were so many nations on Earth that have surface-to-air missile capabilities that she just didn't think that spacecraft would make it back to Earth. Basically some other country would shoot it down out of fear of infected astronauts, sort of taking down the rest of the world. So it's things like that, pepper all of our research, and we have anecdotes like that throughout the book that I think are really eye-opening, and just in terms of how we're trying to protect ourselves from the unknown.
The pandemic of 2020, to me, I would call that, well, it's not even 2020, 2021, 2022, the COVID-19. I would consider the quarantining that has been done, or that was done, to have been emergency isolation, because it was just said immediately with very little warning. I remember the Sunday before the first lockdown, I went to a pool party and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. I live in Florida, and it was the first Sunday in March. All these people were just enjoying life, partying, and then 4 days later, events started getting canceled. And there was, like I said, very little heads up notice. I would call that an emergency situation. So you did a lot of research for your book. The subtitle is The History and Future of Quarantine. What does history tell us about what isolation does to people, and especially emergency isolation, where you don't have time to prepare? Like a hurricane or a tornado, you have time to prepare for it. But when you have such a long-term event like COVID, what does history tell us about emergency isolation and the impact it has on people?
In the very early history of quarantine, what's interesting is actually that it was a communal experience. So in a sense, you were isolated, but you were isolated together. And so it wasn't quite as terrifying. You would be taken out of your house, of course, but you would be brought with your family members, your kids, your grandparents, whoever it might be. You'd see your neighbors, you'd recognize people. It would be as if your neighborhood had just temporarily moved to a very large building together. And so there was, not as much of a psychological effect. It was obviously frustrating and I'm sure terrifying and something that people didn't want to be doing, but it was not quite the emotional journey that it turned into later. And I think that, as quarantine became more individualized and it became more something that happened in particular in the 1800s, when you had travelers, mostly European travelers, for example, would go abroad. And then when they came back from the tropics, when they came back from the other side of the world, they'd be quarantined. They were now considered dangerous, which was quite unique and strange, I think, for Europeans of that era. Suddenly they were the dangerous ones. They weren't the ones that were civilized and clean. They had to be put into quarantine. And I think that really affected them both emotionally and even, psychologically in a larger sense. But yeah, you see it throughout modern quarantine. People get bored. They get frustrated. They tear through things really quickly. Like they'll do their finances. They'll write some letters that they are overdue on. But then they run out of things to do. Maybe they didn't pack enough books. Maybe all they have to read is the Bible. Maybe they don't like the person they've been quarantined with. And so that's when things really started to change psychologically or emotionally, where, you get things like, a lot of quarantine stories, novels that are set in quarantine and people are just bored out of their minds. They want to leave. There's a Dickens novel that's set in quarantine. Quarantine romance, kicked off as a whole new literary genre because people were thinking, well, hey, here I am at this lazaretto. What if I bumped into, some beautiful woman from a foreign country or some handsome man from a ship? What might happen? And that was a tradition that actually, even in COVID-19, we saw quarantine erotica, the idea of, quarantine get-togethers between people who didn't know one another. It kind of kicked off. But we also, one of the things we did for the book was we actually interviewed a boredom researcher, a woman named Erin Westgate, who had been looking at the effects of boredom on people, what it does when you have nothing to do, when you're locked down, or when you're, stuck on a trip you don't want to be on. And, her research was perfect for the era of these lockdowns because, she found a bunch of things with some of the tests that she organized for the experiments, basically that, can be summed up as, people will do bad things if it means they can get out of boredom. And so, her experiments, put people into circumstances or situations that were just incredibly boring. Like they had to watch a video of a rock where nothing happens, for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then they're given an option to do something bad to another person, like take their money or inconvenience them in some way. And people will take they'll inconvenience others. They'll do something bad to another person simply to do something, simply to feel as if they're acting in the world again. And I feel like, that's a cautionary tale, I think, for just what we're getting into in the future of quarantine and these kinds of lockdowns. And so, looking forward, I would say, yes, it's really stressful. It's scary. It's frustrating. It feels kind of dumb. All of a sudden you can't leave. And it's like, are there any cases of the disease even in my city? There's a lot of unanswered questions that make people resist any kind of quarantine order. And I think that a lot of that is going to have to be dealt with in the future because there's going to be another pandemic. It may not be on the scale of COVID-19. It may be much worse than COVID-19. But, people will likely be asked to stay at home again, or at the very least to stay at an airport hotel because somebody on your flight, has come down with a weird disease that they don't know what it is. But, people, we need to be prepared for this as public health authorities. I think those people also need to recognize that you're asking people to do something that's a genuine sacrifice. It's not something you want to do. And so there has to be more steps in the direction of people if you're going to require them to not leave the house or not leave the hotel room, or not even open a window for 2 weeks. These are dramatic, drastic emergency solutions. And I think that the state, the powers that be, need to recognize that and account for it in how they ask us to do it.
I think the powers they can try their best, but at the end of the day, it's up to the individual. And I was just so surprised. Look, we're the work from home show. We help people not just work from home, but succeed from home at all aspects of life, whether it's family, health, wellness, business, investing, work, finance, job, whatever. We try to help them. And it's going to be very difficult for the government. Just look at how much the government is struggling and the public health leaders are struggling with getting people vaccinated. Look how much they struggled with trying to enforce these lockdowns and face masks. It's not going to change. Human behavior is not going to change. I think humans need to look at themselves personally and improve themselves and focus on themselves. It just surprised me how many people, when those lockdowns happened, there were, billions of people worldwide who were fighting it and who couldn't handle being at home and who needed to medicate themselves with. We saw a record overdose or death by overdose in 2020, fentanyl and other drugs. Alcohol sales were through the roof despite all this. I just feel like people need to look at themselves and not necessarily tell themselves, oh, there's going to be another COVID coming in 10 years, so I need to prepare myself. But it's just a daily habit that they need to inculcate and implement so that they can overcome hiccups like this, whether it's a lockdown or whether it's a COVID, a virus that's coming, and making sure that your body and health is prepared for it, your immunity is built. That's just how I see it. I'm more of an individualist than a public mandator.
And that argument, goes all the way back throughout the history of quarantine. Different nations, Britain in particular, at the height of its commercial power, had a totally different attitude toward quarantine than, say, the French or other European powers. And, the Brits instituted a different way of, they basically chose surveillance over quarantine. So saying, hey, you can come into England and, there may be a risk of a disease spreading because of where you've traveled from, but we'll just track your location. We'll make you check in. We'll know where you are. We'll firm up a kind of identity bureaucracy so that, what we would now call contact tracing can take place. But so these kinds of arguments that definitely go back, do we need to quarantine, on a mass level as opposed to individual responsibility? And I agree with everything you're saying about personal responsibility. I think that, I live in Los Angeles where, we have to think about earthquakes and now drought and wildfires as well. But, having extra water in the house, having extra food in the house, just being ready for this thing in case it happens, this thing being an earthquake, is something that is just not a lot of people are ready for. Not a lot of people, they just think, oh, it's not going to happen, or it'll happen 15 years from now, or someday I'll get some backup water so that we'll be safe, but they're not going to do it now. And they kind of, kick the can down the road. I guess I would just say that I think that individual responsibility, as important as it is, and as important as it is to prepare and be ready and to have a plan, we also should be met by competence in governance. Not that government needs to do things for us, but that it wouldn't necessarily have to compel us to do things if we were already ready to do them. But also if there was a better institutional response in place in the first place. Just to give an example of maybe of what I'm talking about, you saw right away that suddenly there was no place to put people. What do you mean quarantine thousands of people or hundreds and hundreds of airline passengers? Where are they going to go? And so you saw people buying old hotels and turning them into quarantine stations. You saw the Javits Center in New York City, a convention hall, being turned into a place full of cots and quarantine facilities. You saw people looking at dormitories on campuses. But my point is that if you looked at the built environment now as an opportunity to change some things, so that quarantine is just another mode of the built environment, that it isn't going to be as expensive next time. If the state could invest in some of these things now, the way they invest in, say, tornado shelters or earthquake preparations, or even building reservoirs in case there's a drought year, quarantine can be this thing that is just there. It's ready for us. We may not need it. Maybe we don't need it for 30 years. But when it does happen, we don't need to spend just millions and millions of dollars and waste people's time and get new committees, voting on things to suddenly redesign, hotels to fit quarantine. If that's just simply part of how things function now, and that's something that, no hotel chain is going to do that willingly, but if they can be, incentivized down that direction by federal, whatever it might be, federal building codes, federal tax incentives, I think that's a responsible way of using the state to make sure that quarantine is not as onerous and as impossible to work out for this many people in the future.
So speaking of the future of quarantining, you talked about how in the past it was more of a community thing. Nowadays, it's very much, individual. In your research, do you think in the future it's going to continue to be individual lockdown in your own homes, or do you think there's a chance we go back to the more community-based quarantining?
At heart, that's a political question. I think that some nations, and we write about this in the book, like China, for example, are certainly going more in the direction of mass quarantine, very large, very rapidly built facilities, or simply just taking an entire tower block, a high-rise apartment building, and not letting people out. That just becomes a place of lockdown or of quarantine. And so I think that it depends a little bit on the culture and the politics of the region where that decision is being made. But since we're talking about the United States, I do think I think it's actually going to become more individualized, at least in the near future. One of the things that we do in the book is we end with a look at all the new sensing technology that we all have now, especially now that we work from home, and its medical potential. And so, we look in the book at things like, Alexa, the Amazon assistant, that Amazon has now patented a way for it to recognize sounds of ill health. Maybe you're coughing or you're sniffling, and it can now recognize that and recommend that you purchase the appropriate thing. That maybe you want to buy some cough drops or you want to subscribe to Advil or whatever it might be.
Another reason that I'm glad I don't have one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, my wife and I came out of this book writing process very happy that we don't have that stuff. But it isn't at all a stretch to look at technology that already exists in the assisted living world. So these are things where if someone can't necessarily take care of themselves, they're living in an assisted living facility. You've now got things like Doppler radar that can show if someone has fallen. You've got sensors in the floor that show if somebody, again, has fallen or they're stumbling or they've started limping, their gait has changed. There's even cameras behind mirrors now that can judge your skin tone. So maybe you are having a cardiac episode or you've had a stroke. There are sensors everywhere that can register things. And it's in our interest, in some cases, to use these things. After all, who doesn't want to be able to diagnose a stroke as quickly as possible so that you can get medical help? But what's interesting is that this is going to, in my opinion, inevitably creep into everyday housing stock. You buy an apartment in Austin, and guess what? It comes with Doppler radar. Guess what? It comes with a speaker that can recognize if you're coughing. Guess what? It comes with all of these other things. And so when you start putting all this stuff together, you've got, the same data giants that own or have access to your search history and might know that maybe you're sick or you have symptoms because you keep on, Googling them, as well as the hours of a nearby pharmacy. If that same company also owns your front door lock and they also operate your home thermostat, there's many, many ways that these things can come together in a pretty dystopian way, so that maybe you have to prove that you're vaccinated to get out of your house. Maybe you have to prove that you're on the way to the doctor, otherwise the front door won't unlock. And so you get into some really strange places when you start looking at how, the corporate world is responding to the challenges of COVID-19, as well as just what this technology might be adding up to. And so, I don't want to sound too dystopian, but I do think that there's something pretty unnerving on the horizon. And I think COVID has accelerated it. But to a certain extent, speaking frankly, I kind of feel like it's inevitable. People are just going to fill their houses with this stuff. It's going to take on a medical role later. And then we'll have to deal with the consequences whenever the next pandemic hits. And we begin to realize, my God, we've surrounded ourselves with, effectively sort of the quarantine technology. And, and we just have to hope it isn't abused. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting 10, 15 years ahead.
I want to switch gears to your previous book, A Burglar's Guide to the City, that did very, very well on the bestseller lists. Let's talk about crime and architecture, because that's what your book is about. What is the relationship between crime and architecture?
Well, yeah, it's at least in terms of that book, I'd say there are two ways that those are connected. On one level, what I wanted to do as an architecture writer was just simply look in the abstract about how people misuse buildings. So, when a homeowner or maybe a historian or a photographer or an architect looks at a house, they look at a building, they might notice historical details. They might notice that, the craftsmanship is top notch. They might notice that, the things carved into the facade are, accurate representations of the plant life that lives in that region or whatever it might be. But when a burglar looks at that same building, they're going to notice totally different things. Maybe they can use that same, the carvings on the front of a building, make great handholds. They can climb up to the second story. Maybe those deep recessed windows that are, interesting to an historian or an architect. Maybe they're also a perfect place to sit in the shadows, so that someone doesn't realize that you're standing outside or casing a building. There's a different way of looking at buildings when you're a criminal, and specifically when you're a burglar as well, and you're trying to find a way into that building that is not through the front door. And so on that level, I wanted to look at the kind of, almost like the dark creativity of people who are trying to think about architecture as a target or as a tactical landscape, as opposed to just something to live in. But then I think also legally, what's interesting is that burglary, specifically the crime of burglary, requires architecture. You just literally and legally cannot have burglary. You can't be a burglar if there isn't a building involved. There is automotive burglary, so I'll just leave that aside, but that's a structure that you would go into. But if you don't go into a building, you can't be a burglar. And so what's interesting about that is that, people have also been busted for burglary, for something as simple as, threatening someone while leaning on the outside of their house, and, the tips of their fingers have crossed into the house on the windowsill. That's considered an entry. So you're considered to be in that person's building. You've entered it, but now you're threatening them, which is a crime. And so that, technically speaking, is burglary. I could go into much, much more detail, but I just, what's interesting is just simply that trying to define or prove that someone was inside at the point that they committed a crime, becomes very, very useful for police, because they can increase your sentence. So, there's many things about it that led me to believe that, there'd be a really fun book to write looking at burglary and architecture. And so, I talked to cops and FBI agents about bank crime and even burglars, and looked at burglary throughout history. And it was a lot of fun.
I did not know that about the kind of fingertip thing. Now, did you find that architects learned from what burglars did and they stopped using like recessed windows? Or was there a shift kind of, does it go back and forth constantly, or did you find that architects are like, well, that's not my problem?
Honestly, I would say it was more the latter. I think that, architects like to believe that they work in a kind of rarefied world of ideas and art. And the idea of thinking about security sounds, at best, not very interesting, and at worst, politically regressive. It sounds as if you're asking them to build a fortress for a rich client or, whatever, something that might be politically distasteful for them. And so what was interesting in writing the book actually was that architects who actually have the most to learn from burglars, tend not to pay much attention to what's happening. And instead, they've outsourced kind of the entire thing to the security industry. And so, an architect will build whatever house you want, and they'll put recessed windows, they'll put anything, they'll put doors, in the worst possible place, because it's so easy to, hide behind a tree and then pick the lock and get into a house. But they'll just leave it up to the private security industry to solve that problem. So you get the house, but then it turns out you got to hire another company to come in and put bars on your window, or to get that, a third deadbolt, or to put an automatic light outside. Those are aftermarket solutions that you actually wouldn't need if architects thought about security from the very beginning. And so I think one of the lessons of the book that I hope would be taken on board by the architecture world is that, thinking through thinking through security from the very beginning is actually, it's better for the economics of a project. It takes less time later. And also it means that you can integrate this stuff into the building so that you don't design some beautiful house for someone only to have them ruin it by putting, burglar bars on the front windows, or, coating everything with security cameras that they don't necessarily need if you had designed a better house. And so those are some of the many, takeaways that came out of the book. But I feel like, the level of interest on the side of burglars in architecture, was something I found consistently. And was really interesting. The kinds of, to realize that a lot of burglars are kind of at heart fans of architecture. That was something that was pretty cool to discover as well.
Well, this somewhat ties into your latest book about quarantine, because during the pandemic of 2020, we saw crime skyrocket. And I don't know if you did any further research, because a book came out years before the Burglar's Guide to the City came out years before the pandemic. But did you happen to find any relationship whatsoever about how the pandemic and even the BLM protests, riots, which saw over $2 billion worth of damage? I'm sure there were tons of burglaries going on. I saw videos of burglaries happening. Did it have any effect on this relationship, what we saw in 2020 and in 2021?
I mean, I would say undoubtedly the idea of mass lockdown, of, businesses being closed, the people being home all day, inevitably is going to change patterns and, crime patterns. It's going to shift police from one type of property to another, maybe even whole different neighborhoods to another. And then, of course, if you're looking at different types of policing altogether, or defunding or removing police from certain neighborhoods, that's also going to have an effect on what happens there, or at the very least what gets solved and what doesn't. But I think that, what I'd say is that there's a lot of really interesting research looking at that now. And I think there's some great, scholars, security researchers, who are going through the numbers basically and figuring out what the direct effects were. What I'd say from more of my expertise in terms of specifically burglary and specifically the quarantine book, what was interesting is that there is actually a relationship between quarantine and burglary, and it goes all the way back to the Black Death, where, if you tell people that this house is empty, this is back when everybody was sent to the lazaretto, so you'd all have to leave your house and go somewhere else. And now if your house is deliberately marked as potentially infected and, do not enter here, if you're a savvy burglar, or for that matter, a stupid burglar, and, you don't realize that you might get the Black Death, or if you've already recovered from it and you're thus immune to it, suddenly now you're in a house full of, you're in a city full of houses that have helpfully been marked for you by the authorities. They say this house is empty. And so there were burglary rings that would often come into existence in cities during the Black Death, because people would team up. They'd find other people who were, savvy, stupid, or immune, and just break into homes and steal things, eventually even targeting the actual lazarettos themselves. And so, sometimes you'll hear stories, because the lazaretto was the place where the people went, but so would the goods and the merchandise that was coming into the city from ships. And so there would just be loads of really expensive goods, timber, furniture, fabrics, all this stuff would be stored in the goods yards. And so what better place to break into than that? You can just steal things that are really valuable and are coming into the city being imported. And so burglary crews would actually rob quarantine stations and then take potentially infected goods into the city. And there are stories of outbreaks being seeded from that kind of behavior. But so, yeah, you do see a interesting relationship between what I think people are tempted to do and what they're tempted to break into, and whether or not they listen to authorities. And that goes back to the problem we were talking about earlier, where, some people just don't trust what authorities are saying is true. And so if you claim there's this disease and you just don't believe that that's true, and you can instead break into the houses of the infected, some people make, the criminal decision as opposed to the responsible one. But so there is an interesting relationship between crime and quarantine. And, I'm actually, pretty interested to see what comes out of the new round of analyses and stuff that are looking back at what happened during COVID.
So would you say, given we're the work from home show, would you say it's a safe bet that crime decreases, or we can expect crime to decrease as more people continue to work from home?
I think that really depends on what kind of crime you're talking about. You could argue
Let's say burglaries.
Yeah, so burglary. And then I'd say the kind of structures would change. But yeah, I would imagine that in our current version of lockdown, and as evidence appears to show over the last year and a half, that home burglaries are down in a time of stay-at-home orders and home quarantine. Anecdotally, though, I've also heard that a lot of bars and restaurants, were broken into all over the country. Even friends here in Los Angeles who own a restaurant were burglarized twice. But partly because exactly there's no one around, so, if there's still something in there, whether it's liquor or some petty cash in the cash register, there's nothing really would keep people out. And so I think the crime shifts. But yeah, I would say fundamentally, though, I'd say, at home burglary, especially during the daylight hours when people are now working at home, was decreasing because of lockdown orders.
Do you have any tips for our listeners who could be, let's say they're quarantining right now, they read your book, they're quarantining, they're alone at home, they're lonely, they're also working from home. Is there a way to burglar proof a home? You brought up like the windowsill, I think, at the beginning of once we started talking about this topic. But any tips at all, or anyone who you cover in the book who can help individuals better burglar proof their home, or maybe build their home? Home building is such a it's been very bullish. Home builders have been so busy during the pandemic. Anything that they should know to keep burglars out?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I mean, I think that the key thing psychologically, and it's kind of like the quarantine idea, that quarantine can still be, it doesn't have to be 100% effective to work. You really can't burglar proof a building. You can just make burglars less inclined to pick that one. And so what I mean is, like, if you've got, $15 million of cash sitting on the kitchen table and a burglar can see it, it doesn't matter if they see 8 different alarm systems and a shotgun on the wall. Like, if they want to get in, they're going to get into your building. The question really is trying to deter people from wanting to choose a house, of course, that doesn't have $50 million of cash sitting on the front table. And so that just means getting someone to see a house and decide, this particular place isn't worth it to me. And that can be relatively easy. I mean, it's a cliche, but even having a sign that says there's a burglar alarm can be enough to just make someone say, forget it, I'm going to go to the next building. And that 2 or 3 seconds of doubt is really what you're looking to instill in a burglar. Timers on lights, especially if they are not on at the exact same hours every single day. Even in different rooms of your house can be a good idea. And with the era of LED lights, it's not even a large energy use. If you own your house and you've been there for a while, even relatively silly sounding things like if you plant a thorny rose bush kind of thing in front of your window, that alone can be enough to make someone not, scramble through the underbrush and try to get in through a window. Even sometimes having weather sealed windows that are, double or triple paned can be enough that if someone comes up to your house and they're going to smash the window to get in, there's so much more glass and there's so much more of a pain in the butt to get through that window that they'll bring attention to themselves. That you get, you can go that route. So my point is not that there's not like one product you can buy, like get this security camera or invest in this kind of lock. It's a lot of little things that if you do them all with the idea in mind that you're simply trying to make someone not target your apartment or not target your house, that's really all you're trying to do, because that way they'll move on, they'll go to the next street, they'll go to another neighborhood, maybe the mood will pass. The overwhelming majority of burglaries committed are, crimes of the moment, crimes of opportunity, or crimes of desperation. And so you just want to get, you want to interrupt that thought process and make them go somewhere else.
Yeah, and I've got a few more tips. You brought up the lights. I've heard the lights help a lot, not just LED, but just having a home that is well lit will deter burglars compared to a home that's completely dark. There might be people inside, but lights could be off inside. Lights are completely off outside. That helps. I heard having a dog bowl. So even if you don't have a dog, but you have a big bowl of dog food and a bowl at the front and the back is a big deterrent. And then I also heard an American flag is a deterrent as well, because it could depend on the state, but where Adam and I are in Texas and Florida, you have an American flag and people might think, okay, this person
probably a couple guns.
Yeah. And gun owners don't own one gun or two guns. I think the average gun owner owns 8 guns. It's like people who are into sneakers. You don't just own one nice pair of sneakers. You own like 10 of them.
I think those are good tips. The American flag one is a little new to me, but I can definitely see the deduction that you would come to there. But yeah, the dog bowl, little things like that make a house look like maybe you've got something that you really don't have. Yeah, like a dog or an alarm system or whatever it might be. Those are good ideas. You can even get fake TV, which is a kind of a funny product that when I first saw it, I thought was kind of a joke, but it's basically almost like a Light Bright, the old children's game. That just lights up in different patterns so that if you see it from outside, it appears to be a television that's changing. You're watching a scene in a movie, but that can turn on for, 2.5 hours, make it look like you're at home watching television in the upstairs. But it's actually just a random changing light display that you can put on a timer. So yeah, things like that. It can all add up.
Geoff Manaugh. Get his books, A Burglar's Guide to the City, and the new book, Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine. They're available on Amazon. The website's Geoff Manaugh, that's GEOFF MANAUGH, GeoffManaugh.com, as well as his famous architecture blog, BLDGBLOG.com, BLDGBLOG.com. Geoff Manaugh, thank you for joining us on the Work From Home Show. To all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. Email us if you have any questions. hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Leave us a review on whatever podcasting platform you use to listen to us. We would greatly appreciate that. Email that review to hello@workfromhomeshow.com. We'll send you back a goodie free of charge. Follow us on social media. We are everywhere. And until next week, keep on working from home.